What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review David Fincher's new movie, Mank, which is coming to Netflix on December 4th. The film's playing in limited theatrical release right now. I had to go to Hoboken, New Jersey to see it. I'll avoid making any comments that some might regard as a spoiler, but because this film is about the life of screenwriter Herman J. Mankiewicz, aka Mank, and several key chapters of his life, anything that's part of history, or more importantly, film history, I'm going to consider fair game for discussion. But just so no one accuses me of burying the lead, I love the film. Classic movie fans are going to wet their pants when they see it. And I think Gary Oldman delivers one of his all-time best performances as he gambles and boozes and swaggers his way through Hollywood's golden age, working with and frequently locking horns with some of the most distinctive and powerful individuals of that period, namely Irving Thalberg, Louis B. Mayer, Orson Welles, and most importantly, newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst. I worry a little bit that casual viewers on Netflix might be a little bewildered if they're expecting to see a new David Fincher flick along the lines of Fight Club or Seven, because there's no getting around the fact that this is a deep dive into movie history from the early 30s to the early 40s, and I suspect it's going to polarize some audience members depending upon their expectations from David Fincher. But it's absolutely incredible to me that David Fincher has not directed a new movie since Gone Girl back in 2014. Although he did direct a lot of incredible episodes of Mindhunter over on Netflix. But Mank, it's a true passion project for David Fincher, one that he tried to do back in the late 90s, but it got put on a shelf over his insistence that he shoot the film in black and white. You would think that the fact that he and Madonna had already conquered the world with their black and white music video for Vogue, that it might have persuaded people to come around to his point of view, but for whatever reason, no one would make the movie at that time. But the reason making the film is so important to David Fincher is that it was written by his father, Jack Fincher, who died back in 2003. The film itself chronicles many of the key events of screenwriter Herman J. Mankiewicz's life from the early 30s to the early 40s. And the Gary Oldman, he's just firing on all cylinders in this role, holding nothing back, and he's given ample room by Fincher to take over one scene after another with these extraordinary drunken rants. The central conflict of the movie is to what degree Mank might try and ridicule William Randolph Hearst when he accepts an assignment to work on a screenplay alongside Orson Welles, the boy wonder of radio and Broadway who has freshly arrived in Hollywood to make his first feature film. The screenplay is initially called American, but will eventually come to be known by its more famous title, Citizen Kane. Now, I went into this movie thinking that the main drama at play would be about this decades-old argument over who deserves more of the credit for the screenplay for that remarkable movie. Back in the early 70s, film critic Pauline Kael put the smackdown on Orson with her essay, Raising Cain, which prompted filmmaker Peter Bogdanovich to hit back with his counter-arguments in a rebuttal called The Cain Mutiny. Nowadays, they would have simply screamed at each other on Twitter, but I worried ahead of time that this new film would simply relitigate an old argument about a subject that only a niche audience is really passionate about. Personally, I'm obsessed with the subject, but that's because Orson Welles is my favorite filmmaker, so this new movie is right in my sweet spot for topics that grab me. But the reality is that Orson isn't in the movie that much, even if his shadow is felt over many of the proceedings. There are a few nasty scenes over authorship and credit, but these pale in comparison to the real conflict at the heart of Fincher's movie, the one between Mank, Louis B. Mayer, and William Randolph Hearst. Between Mayer's studio, MGM, and Hearst's newspapers all across the country, these two friends wield considerable influence over public opinion and play an active role in the 1934 California gubernatorial election. And Mank, he's granted a seat at the table with all these heavy hitters, in a role resembling that of court jester, speaking harsh truths to men in power. And from the word go, a falling out is inevitable. And eventually, Mank decides to air his many grievances in this mammoth script, one that proves to be so controversial that Louis B. Mayer offers to buy it outright from RKO just so Orson Welles could never make it into a movie. Luckily, Welles had total autonomy on his first movie for RKO. The flick got made, and the rest is history. Mank and Welles won an Oscar for the script, and the film came to be regarded by many as one of the best movies ever made. And for a lot of directors who came of age in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Citizen Kane was their Bible. And it's a movie that I've watched with a giant smile on my face many times over. My hope, and perhaps it's a naive hope, is that the film Mank will ignite an interest both in this era as well as the many filmmakers and writers featured as characters in the stories. I'm obsessed with this era, so I'm completely blind with my own enthusiastic bias. But sadly, I think that for every young person out there who does take an interest in the subject, there will likely be many more who could not give less of a shit. Because this flick offers almost no hand-holding or explanations of any kind to the uninitiated, and if you don't already know who someone like Joseph Mankiewicz is, who's Mank's brother, this movie's not really willing to throw those folks a bone. But if I were to try and sell people on watching this, and I'm talking about folks who might be unfamiliar with the history of the story, I'd argue that David Fincher's behind-the-scenes depiction of the hard-drinking, old-school Hollywood in glorious black and white is a very special experience. In particular, Mank's friendship with actress Marion Davies, played by Amanda Seyfried. Amanda Seyfried is absolutely fucking delightful in the role, perhaps the best she's ever been. And as Hearst's wife, she's naturally caught in the middle as Mank goes to war against her husband, who's brought to life by the great Charles Dance. Jack Fincher's script is a true love song to this era, and it inserts all sorts of legendary quotes and anecdotes, scenes that are probably more legend than fact, but are fun to see nonetheless. And speaking of that era, David Fincher's frequent music collaborators, Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, they composed the score using only instruments from that era, and they do everything in their power to capture a musical grandeur that, in my opinion, won't compare unfavorably to Bernard Herrmann's legendary score for Citizen Kane. The movie's littered with all these interesting visual and musical cues that are a throwback to certain scenes from that movie, almost as if Mank's life is the visual inspiration for the movie, as opposed to the life of William Randolph Hearst. But the real treat for film freaks is the way that legendary figures will just stroll in and out of scenes with very little warning or fanfare, especially early on when we see Mank in his prime, collaborating with some of the best writers of that era, legends like Ben Hecht, who worked both credited and uncredited on just about every classic of that period. And there's this great scene where they're pitching an idea to one of my all-time favorite directors, Joseph von Sternberg, whose films with Marlene Dietrich like Shanghai Express and The Scarlet Empress are some of my favorite of that period. The biggest surprise for me, though, was what a great job Tom Burke did as Orson Welles. Welles was this larger-than-life figure with a voice that Simon Cowell describes as having the power to curl around your brain. Imitating his persona has proven disastrous for many actors in the past, but honestly, I have zero complaints with Burke's performance. I don't even really have any issues over the film's portrayal over the battle over credit for the script. I love Welles' work, but he wasn't a perfect human being, far from it. And while he was happy to let his director of photography, Greg Toland, share the same title card with him on Citizen Kane, anytime you get two egomaniacs collaborating on a script, authorship inevitably will be in question. And I read an interview once where Welles was giving Mank credit for some of the best scenes of the film, like when Mr. Bernstein's remembering a beautiful girl he saw decades ago, and the writing of that scene is explored particularly well in David Fincher's film. But here's the reality that will settle all debates and confusion over authorship. Mank's script for American is readily available. Anybody who's curious can read it, so my advice for people would be, read the script, then watch Citizen Kane, and then come to your own conclusions. In any case, I'm fired up to watch this again when it comes out on Netflix. I laughed uproariously throughout most of it. There was one other person in the theater and they were snoring throughout half of it, so I don't think everyone's going to have the exact same experience that I did. But it blows my mind just how much Netflix has done to explore Orson Welles' career. Between the documentary They'll Love Me When I'm Dead, or doing their best to restore The Other Side of the Wind, and now with the film Mank, you can make a case for Netflix doing more to expose a new generation to Welles' work than just about any other platform or individual over the last 10 years. Back in the 90s when I first got obsessed with Welles, I used to have to scour my library for these old bootleg VHS cassettes of really crummy prints of Welles' movies to try and study his career. But now more of his movies are available in pristine condition than ever before. If you want to see what the fuss is all about with this career, watch Citizen Kane, Touch of Evil, Chimes of Midnight, and F for Fake, or check out his legendary radio broadcast for War of the Worlds from the late 30s, or check out his performances in movies like The Third Man. And if you're into those, I'd recommend Lady from Shanghai and Magnificent Ambersons, Othello, Macbeth, The Trial. They're all worth seeing, but it'd be too time-consuming right now to go into the troubled production histories of many of these movies and which versions to see. But Netflix gets a huge high five for me for getting behind this movie, and if it encourages more people to take an interest in these individuals featured in the story, I'll chalk that up as a win. Just the fact that David Fincher has made another feature film, that alone is worth celebrating. So I think that's all I have to say about this movie for now. What I'm going to try and do between now and the release of Mank on Netflix is I want to do a flashback review of Citizen Kane on this channel, but with Thanksgiving, I don't know, the schedule might get a little tight. But if you enjoyed this review, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, and if you want to talk more about David Fincher or Orson Welles, whatever, hunt me down on Twitter at Colbrax. But I can't thank you enough for watching the video. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.